No mai, haere mai, everyone. Welcome to this next seminar in the Te Puna Haumaru seminar series. It is my absolute privilege and pleasure to introduce Dr. Paul Brown, who's going to talk to us about his research as part of the UPD project looking at data and prosecution. Dr. Paul Brown is a lecturer in statistics at the University of Waikato. His research interests include computational Bayesian inference, statistical modelling, and Māori data sovereignty. Dr. Brown was a member of the research team for phase 1 of the UPD project. So over to you, Paul.
Kia ora. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā matawaka o te motu nei, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai, I tēnei kōrero, I tēnei rā. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou katoa. Ngā mihi ki April, rātou ko Te Puna Haumaru, mō tō pōhirihiri, me tō tautoko. Ngā mihi mai oha ki a koutou. Ko waio, he uria hou no tainoi waka, ko karioi tōku maunga, ko whaingaroa, ko kāwhia oku moana, ko tainoi, ko Ngāti Kairo oku iwi, ko Paul Brown tōku ingoa. Kei te mahi ahau ki kai tātauranga me te pūkenga ki te wharewananga o Waikato. So kia ora everyone, and thank you for attending this kōrero today. So, and thank you to April and Te Puna Haumaru for this invitation to speak to you all today. Like April and I said, my name is Paul Brown. I'm a lecturer and statistician here at the University of Waikato. I was part of or one of the research teams involved in the Understanding Policing Delivery project, whose phase 1 reports came out around about a month ago, mid-August. There were 7 reports in total, and I was responsible for 2 of those reports, one to do with prosecutions, and the other looking at the kind of the data systems and the data infrastructure of New Zealand Police, Ngā Pirihimana or Aotearoa. So what I'll do today is I'll talk a little bit about the Understanding Policing Delivery, the UPD kaupapa, and just give a bit of an overview of that project and my responsibilities and role in that project. And then I will speak on the prosecutions report. The title of that report was The Assessments of Factors Influencing Police Prosecution Decision-Making. And I'll go a little bit in the weeds of the data that was used, the modeling techniques, some of the results that came out, the highlights, and the recommendations that we gave. Over those 7 reports that were put out, there were over 40 recommendations to New Zealand Police, and we're happy that they had started taking up some of those recommendations as we were putting out this research. So that's the presentation outline for today. So getting straight into it, the UPD kaupapa. So the main purpose was to investigate whether, where and to what extent bias may exist in New Zealand policing services. So trying to determine how police deliver their services to different communities in Aotearoa. Now, the main focus was on looking at bias here as systemic bias, not interpersonal or a little bit of unconscious bias, but not interpersonal biases. So looking at it from a structural point of view, what policies are in place within Ngā Pirihimana that may affect outcomes for certain communities? What are the procedures and what are the training methods that are being used? And although we looked across different communities, such as the Rainbow community, Pacifica community, etc., police Māori relations were a large focus of this kaupapa. Had a great conversation about the kind of principles and ethics that guide us, and there was an ethics process related to understanding policing delivery for all research teams. So Te Tiriti or Waitangi was kind of central to the ethics that and the research methods that we used in this kaupapa. Now, there were three key research areas. The first research area was who police stop and talk to and how they engage with who they stop and talk to. The second was decision-making around the use of force, and the third was decision-making around prosecutions. The decision-making around prosecutions was a big focus for me in this kaupapa. Now, the research approach that we took, and there's been a bit of talk around how the research was actually done. The research was done by three different research teams: Ihi Research, Mana Pounamu Consulting, and the Donald Beasley Institute. My role in this was to provide quantitative support where needed for the three research teams, but also to look more deeper into the prosecutions and something called the data stocktake and gaps analysis, which I'll talk about in a second. So the research was done by us, by the three research teams and myself. The research was overseen by two groups. One was the independent panel, led by Kim Workman and Professor Kylie Quince. And that was a panel that was made up of a lot of community advocates, as well as some police representation in there, including Grant O'Fee, who was an ex-superintendent a few years back. There was also another group which was extremely helpful, the Police Official Advisory Group, the Police OAG, led by Superintendent Scott Gemmell. And they were really there to provide support to the research teams to give some context about our findings and what we were seeing. I am not a prosecutor. I'm not involved very heavily or at all really with New Zealand Police or police on more of a police on a local scale. So, you know, as a statistician, I can come in and I can, do some data analysis and report it all on the findings, speak on the findings. But to give that extra kind of context, I really needed the help of police to say, well, you know, I see the statistic. What is that actually saying? Does that make sense for you who are kaimahi on the ground, those that are actually on the ground working in this area that I don't know anything about really, other than what I learned when I started doing this research and the data analysis that gave me some insights. So, and the research teams worked with both the independent panel and the police OAG to kind of get more of an understanding of our findings. So that was really, really helpful. And I do want to add as well that they did provide guidance, but in the end, the findings that I found from the data were the findings that were found from the data. It wasn't, there's no unnecessary influence or anything like that. So it was a really nice approach, especially for someone like me who's a bit more early career. It was really, gave me some great insights in how the production of research should really be done when you're talking about groups that you're not necessarily involved with. So kind of already spoke on my role, but my roles here were to provide quantitative support to the research teams, research into the research area 3 stream, decision-making around prosecutions. Now, the first phase of the UPD kaupapa was to kind of ground things in evidence and use data to inform findings from these 3 key research areas. But that's easier said than done with police data. There's not necessarily great data on who police stop and talk to and how they engage. Police collect data as a function of their service, but they are not data collection machines. So not all interactions that they have data is not necessarily collected for it. Think of a roadside stop, for instance. So there wasn't much data in that first research area. There was more on use of force and prosecutions. And so prior to me actually coming into this project, there were some discussions had between members of the independent panel and data experts within New Zealand Police to see what data actually was there that could be used for this kind of research, and what data is missing if you want to use police operational data as research. Those conversations help structure, at least for me, the research into police prosecution decision making, because fortunately in that context there is more data that can be used. So let's get into it. So I'll just add that I won't be speaking on the data stock taking gaps analysis in this port at all. I'll just be focusing on the decision making around prosecutions. So decision making around prosecutions, the research idea was to take a quantitative approach, since there was data available that we could take this approach. So the research idea was to assess factors that may influence a decision about whether a prosecution takes place or the prosecution doesn't take place. So there's an element, well, there's a part of the process where a decision has to be made, and it's binary: prosecute or not to prosecute. So using police data, primarily through the NIA, the National Intelligence Application, we collected proceedings data with a range of different variables. So these variables included demographic data, age, sex, ethnicity, and these demographic variables were actually available in the prosecution's dataset. Offence type, the type of offence that occurred, and there's a little bit of subtlety that I'll describe when talking about the offence type. Proceeding attributes, what were the attributes of the proceeding, where the proceeding took place, and the time of the proceeding, and history of police contact of the subject of a proceeding. So the subject who is in this proceeding process, what prior police contact had they had, such as were they a subject of investigation, were they an informant, etc. There was a whole lot of data on that. And so what we wanted to do with all of these variables was to develop a model to assess what factors, which of these factors may influence the decision to prosecute, and to quantify that influence, to understand to what extent demographic characteristics may influence decisions. I should note here that demographic characteristics were a large focus of this because of the UPD kaupapa, looking at how police deliver their services to different communities, with police Māori relations being a major focus. So in terms of how we went about doing this, so the data set that we collected contained over 141,000 unique proceedings from 2017 to 2022, so roughly 6 years worth. Data comes from the NIA database, and there was a filtering process from this 141,000. So just to give a bit more context to how the data comes about, an arrest had to be made and a proceeding conducted, and that's the that's the kind of unit of interest, was the proceeding. And a particular incident could actually have multiple different offences. So in terms of what offence to use, the most serious offence of a single incident was recorded in this data set. So if you go onto something like policedata.nz and look at the number of proceedings that took place over these several years, there's a lot more than 141,000. But the reason why is we took just one particular offence, which is the most serious offence recorded. Now, for modelling, we had a subset of the original data set. So of that 141,000, after filtering and clearing proceedings with missing data, over 62,000 observations were included for modelling. Now, in terms of age, we only focused on adults, so 18 years and older. Now, in 2019, there was legislation passed, I believe, that that changed the definition of youth from 17 to 18 years old. So even though youth offenders from 2019 or prior to 2019 were 17 years, we didn't include the 17-year-olds that were in that data set, only the 18-year-olds, just to make things consistent over those 6 years in the modelling. Now, offence type. Now, we use the ANSOC group disaggregation, and there are, I think, 104 different groups of offences. And what we did was we took offences that fit a certain criteria. So roughly there had to be between a 10 to 90% prosecution rate. You might think, why is that? What we didn't want to do was model proceedings where the outcome of that proceeding, whether to prosecute or not, was a function of the offence itself. So you think of something like a homicide or attempted murder or something really serious, aggravated sexual assault, etc. There's almost, or in some cases, there is a 100% prosecution rate. We wanted to take the offence type where there was some police discretion involved. A decision had to be made. So that's why we took these, you might say, fairly arbitrary numbers, offence prosecution rates between 10 and 90%. And we also wanted offence types where there was a significant amount of observation, so at least 1,000 or more. And in the end, of those 106, there were 12 that fit that criteria. So that's why we went from a 141 to 62,000. So there's quite a bit of filtering involved in that process. But I will add there that 62,000 is still a very large sample. So I don't want to get into the weeds too much of the modelling process, but because of the large sample size, we didn't have too many issues with large standard errors or large or multicollinearity and things like that. So the models that we developed were relatively stable. So just some information about the model that's necessary to understand the results. The response variable here was the subject of a proceeding is either prosecuted, that score is given a 1, or not, that score is given a 0. So the context and how this binary variable comes about, a subject is apprehended where they may be arrested, receive a warning, or be summoned. Now, if the subject is arrested, a second decision is made whether to prosecute or not. So that's the kind of narrow focus of the response variable here. This two-step process of a prosecution decision being made is first the subject is arrested, and then that second decision is made whether to prosecute or not. And those were the rows of data that we had. So the focus, like I said, is on the second decision whether to charge or not, and that's what that's the outcome variable there, the response, whether the subject of a proceeding is prosecuted or not. Now, in a practical sense, once that decision to charge or not is done, demographic data is collected at that point, as well as other data, and that provides the best sample to work with. Non-prosecution decisions, warnings, verbal warnings, alternative action such as te pai oranga or an AA plan, community justice panels, those were given a 0 because the decision was made not to prosecute and to go with an alternative outcome. So that was the response variable. That's the variable of interest. Now, for the variables that are going to explain or predict that outcome, we had demographic information. Age, of course, was used. Aroha mai, I forgot to add in a couple of slides before that, there were some internal studies done in 2017 and 2020 that that looked at the influence of factors regarding prosecutions as well. And I just want to mention that because in that model, they also had age, but they had a little bit of a different categorization. First of all, these studies were done prior to that legislation, or at least the data collected was prior to the legislation about youth. So they had age categories from 17 to 18, 19 to 20, 21 to 30, and then 31, or 20 to 29, sorry, and 30 onwards. We chose a little bit of a different categorization of age. We went for 18 to 30, 31 to 45, 46 to 64, and 65 plus to kind of get a feel on over time or over the variable age, how prosecutions change as age increases. And I'll get to those results and some of the alternative models that we did and why we ended up choosing this particular categorization. We also had sex of the subject of a prosecution, male or female. These are the only two, well, actually there's a third, there's unknown as well, but these were the only two informative disaggregation of the sex variable. So just male or female. Ethnicity. Now there are several different ethnicities that you can put into the NIA database. Because of numbers of smaller ethnicity categories such as Mala, Middle Eastern, Latin American, and African, we actually included both Asian, Mala, and all the others and unknowns that are in the police data system into a single variable called other. It's other here. Okay. Otherwise, we had New Zealand European as one category, Māori for another category, Pacifica for the third category, and then you had this wider ranging ethnicity variable there of other. We had whether the subject of a proceeding was a gang member or a known gang member associate, either yes or no, and prior convictions had the subject of the offence or subject of the proceeding, excuse me, had any prior convictions prior to this particular proceeding, and that's either a yes or no. Attributes of the proceeding. So we collected several different variables here. Whether the crime was discovered by the officer or not, yes or no. The police area. So the location of the proceeding was disaggregated down to the police district level. And there are 12 policing districts. Offence type. Now, I went into the offence type criteria before. The frequency had to be greater than 1,000 and a prosecution rate between 10% and 90% in the ANSOC group level. And these were the 12 different offence types that we modeled. Common assault, dangerous or negligent operation of a vehicle, threatening behavior, so on and so forth. So these were the particular offence types that are included in the model, and a time variable of year. Any prior offending with police was also used as an explanatory variable, and there are actually quite a few different variables that we had, which was handy, but a lot of them did not make it into the final model, which I'll talk about in a sec. So any prior contact with police as either a contact person, subject of investigation, prior informant, etc. Total number of proceedings in the 6 years prior to the offence, and also total number of proceedings in the past year prior to the offence occurring. So that kind of gives more of a long-term perspective of the subject's behaviour, both a long-term view and a more recent view. Number of days between the current and most recent prior offence, and the most serious prior offence was also included from the NOI score. So those were the range of variables. There were over 40 variables that were included in in the beginning, and then there was a modeling process to filter out models that were highly correlated with others or did not provide any value to the model. And because there was a binary decision, a binary outcome, whether to prosecute or not, we chose to perform a multiple logistic regression model, which is kind of a go-to standard statistical model that's used for modeling binary responses or binary outcomes. So that was used to quantify the influence of an explanatory variable or variables on the decision to prosecute, given all other variables remain constant in the model. Now, for those of you that are listening, watching this this video, or this kōrero, I should say, modeling is an iterative process, okay? It's not just your one and done. There's a lot of different models to cycle through. There's a lot of different models to compare. You can also include not only the single variables, but interactions of variables, which we also tried, but in the end did not use in this particular model or any other higher level interactions, due really to interpretability issues. The measure of the likelihood. So what you'll hear me say in the next few slides when we talk about the results is the likelihood of prosecution. What's the effect of a particular variable, say ethnicity or age, etc., on the likelihood of prosecution? And that's given by an odds or adjusted odds ratio. For that model comparison piece, the Akaike Information Criterion, or AIC as it's more commonly known as, was used for model comparisons. And so that gives us a way of filtering down the models to decide, well, which model is best fitting of my model according to that particular criterion. So our model, and you can go to the report and have a look at what that model looks like, or at least what the variables in that model had an effect or that didn't have an effect. But age, and this categorization of age, was found to be a strong demographic factor. And so the story of the outcomes, without getting too mathematical on you, is that as age increases, generally the likelihood of prosecution increases. Though as a subject of a proceeding moves into the older age categories, that likelihood decreases until it actually decreases a lot lower in that 65 plus category of age. Now, we modeled age also in different ways. Like I said, we modeled it in the same way as the previous studies did, but they were their outcome or their conclusion was that as age increases, the likelihood of prosecution increases. Now that's fine, but it doesn't account for the effect of what happens as the subject gets quite a bit older. Because if you remember, that large categorization was for 30 plus, and that's a huge category. Okay, so the other thing that we did was model age as a continuous variable. So instead of categorizing it, we just told the model, hey, age is just a numerical value, and so what happens as age increases over time? And that came back with the same conclusion, that as age increases, generally the likelihood of prosecution also increases. But it's a bit too broad, that statement, because it doesn't actually, it just shows a general average rather than the average of these categories. And that's important for the results that we actually found. So on average, so this is the second point here, on average, those between 31 and 45 were 67% more likely to be prosecuted than those aged between 18 and 30, given all other variables remain constant. Now, what that means, okay, is that if we hold everything the same, all the other variables in our model the same the same offence type, the same preceding location, the same year, the same ethnicity, the same gender. The only difference is that age category. One subject is between 18 and 30, one is between 31 and 45. On average, the subject between 31 and 45 was 67% more likely than the subject between 18 and 30. That's what that statement means. So moving into the next category, 45 to 64, and comparing it to the reference level, 18 to 30, those between 45 and 64 were 57% more likely to be prosecuted than those aged between 18 and 30. And then no significant difference in likelihood of prosecution was found between those 18 and 30 and those aged 65. So instead of like a constant increase, there's an increase until you get to the later stages of life, if you're the subject of a proceeding, and that goes back down to around about where the 18 to 30-year-old likelihood of prosecution is. So that was age. And just to remind you, demographic factors were a large focus of this study. So ethnicity here was actually not found to be a strong demographic factor. Now there was one significant difference, and that was between Māori and New Zealand European. So recall that we have 4 categories of ethnicity: New Zealand European, Māori, Pacifica, and other. So on average, Māori were 11% more likely to be prosecuted than a subject that was New Zealand European. So again, all other things remaining constant, the same offence type, the same location, the same, now in this case it's the same age category, etc., etc. Māori, just by being Māori, were 11% more likely to be prosecuted on average. Now, one thing that we did after we made this model was we actually disaggregated down into the different offence type categories to see if there were differences between different groups for particular offences. So for common assault, Māori were 29% more likely than New Zealand Europeans to be prosecuted. So that's given everything remains constant other than Māori other than their ethnicity and their offence type, because this is for common assault. And for theft from a retail premises, Māori were 40% more likely on average to be prosecuted, given everything else remains constant. Now, gang membership was it was an extremely strong predictor or explainer of the likelihood of prosecution. So in this particular variable, we're comparing those that are a known associate of a gang or are known to be a gang member versus those that aren't. And the likelihood of prosecution for a gang member or associate was on average 93% higher than for non-gang members or associates. I've seen in some media that there was some kind of comments about something like this. Oh, of course they are. But that doesn't really take into the nuance that the model's saying. What we're saying is that hold everything else constant. There is the same number of prior convictions, same number of proceedings, the same location, the same gender, the same ethnicity, etc., etc. The only difference is you've got a non-gang member versus a known gang member or associate, and the likelihood of prosecution, given everything else remaining constant, is 93% higher for the gang member. Disaggregating down into different offence types, gang members were over 4 times more likely to be prosecuted for common assault, 3 times more likely for possessing illicit drugs, and 2.5 times more likely for both trespassing and disorderly conduct. So being a member of a gang or a gang associate is not great for your chances of not being prosecuted. Some other results, and so if you're so inclined, please feel free to read the reports. You can find them on the New Zealand Police Ngā Pirihimana or Aotearoa website under the Understanding Policing Delivery tab. Some other things that we found: there was no significant difference in the likelihood of prosecution between men and women. Now, this was an interesting finding because the other two reports had actually found a different conclusion, that men were more likely to be prosecuted than women. I should add that the other two reports found similar results to what we found regarding age and ethnicity and gang membership as well. There's just slight differences in the numbers. There were significant differences across policing districts. So perhaps there's evidence to suggest that your likelihood of prosecution is somewhat influenced by where you're being prosecuted, which policing district you're prosecuted in. Offenders with prior convictions were 47% more likely on average to be prosecuted than those without prior convictions. And as the number of proceedings increased over time, the likelihood of prosecution increased over those with no proceedings. So if you've had proceedings or been involved in or been a subject of a proceeding in the past, the likelihood of you being prosecuted increases. Now, there's a number of limitations, as there is, to all statistical models. And so one kind of glaring variable that is missing out of this is socioeconomic status of the subject of a proceeding. Now, that can be quite hard to determine, although if you work in the IDI, you'd probably use the New Zealand deprivation indices in the different statistical areas and correlate that with an address of the subject of an offender at the time of the proceeding, if you can. Now, there was some like I said in the beginning, there was an ethics proposal that we had to go through once we had proposed the research. And one thing that we did not want to do with the data is make it identifiable. Having an address is quite an identifiable variable to have. So we did not have it in the model and one of the reasons being that. Now, in the previous two studies, the one done in 2017 and 2020, they had both used socioeconomic status in the modeling process, but in both, they decided due to the modeling process not to include those. So they did not have socioeconomic status in the final model, but they did a separate analysis of that particular variable to the likelihood or the rate of, the likelihood of prosecution. But you might think, well, that probably is quite an important variable to have, though can be quite a complex variable to have, not only for the quality of the value that you can get, but it's quite highly correlated with other variables that we have in the model, such as ethnicity and age. So there's some confoundingness with having this particular variable, which is why the other studies did not have socioeconomic status in their final model. I talked previously about the offence types and the assumptions of that. Got to be over 1,000 and between a prosecution rate of between 10 and 90%. So we're actually modeling police discretion. Now, it's quite a arbitrary value. I didn't almost kind of, at least for the rates of prosecution, sort of plucked out of thin air, but really it came back to practical matter here. We needed offence types. We didn't want to include offence types where there were only, very few observations seen, like, I don't know, like 10 or 20, something like that. We wanted to include those where there was a large number of proceedings so that we could actually disaggregate the model down and model the likelihood of prosecution if you've committed a certain offence, or if the subject, sorry, has committed a certain offence. But those assumptions are relatively arbitrary. So anyone that would do this in the future might make different assumptions on that particular variable. The categorical groupings of variables, this came up a few times in conversations with both the police OAG and the independent panel about what the best grouping of variables is to really tell that story. I think we've got it roughly pretty right, but some may disagree. But there are other categorical groupings as well that some not really raised objections, but at least raised some concerns with, especially regarding around ethnicity, including a big bubble of other. Doesn't seem quite nice. And then you've got Māori, but there's a disaggregation down from Māori, actually really in Pacifica as well, of the different iwi regarding Māori and the different Pacifica communities, the Samoan community, Pong and the Cook Island, etc. But for practical reasons, we couldn't really go deeper. We didn't have enough data to really go deep and see, well, what's the difference between Cook Island and Cook Island Māori versus Māori or New Zealand European, etc. So that was, I suppose, a limitation and an assumption that we've made of that particular variable of ethnicity. Then there were data limitations, and there's holes in data. Real world data is pretty messy, and there are data that is just not available. So I talked about demographic data, attributes of a proceeding, prior history, etc. Another variable that would be quite nice to have, though maybe a contentious issue, other than socioeconomic status, was the attributes of those that were involved in the arrest or those that were involved in the decision making around that prosecution. There's none of that, and that's because the data is not collected. And it might also go against a little bit the kaupapa or the kind of purpose of the kaupapa regarding we're looking more at structural bias. How can we affect and change different policies and procedures and training that are correlated with the outcome or of a negative outcome for particular communities? We also have no data on disabilities, those coming through the proceeding process that have mental health illness or physical disabilities, etc. Also, information on the rainbow community that would have been interesting and perhaps helpful and insightful information, but that data, and probably correctly, that data is not collected, at least not by police. So all sorts of data limitations, because you can take these modeling exercises, to the moon and back, but you're without the data, you really can't. So yeah, those were some of the data limitations, and we talk about it in the report. Now, at the end, we made some recommendations. There were over 40 recommendations of those 7 reports. This particular report had 3. And I'll get into why we only had 3. But the report, the conclusion was that that the model showed there were several factors that may influence the decision to prosecute. There was a correlation between the likelihood of prosecution and these different factors, including demographic factors that we really want to look at. So this really answered the question, if we go back to the purpose of the UPD kaupapa, whether or if bias exists. We don't necessarily determine how that comes about or where in particular it comes about in the process. So the recommendations were to continue with this exercise over time to monitor progress. The previous two reports had shown, for example, that Māori were 19% more likely to be prosecuted on average than New Zealand European, given all other variables were held constant. That was the 2017 report. The 2020 reports showed 11%, the same as what we showed. So over time, you could actually argue that there is evidence that there is some progress that police are making regarding the likelihood of prosecution for Māori. And so this needs to be continued on. We need to make sure that we're investigating this over regular intervals. A more in-depth evaluation is needed to understand why these discrepancies actually exist. You actually need to go down, dig right down into the different areas of the proceeding processes to understand why these factors influence police prosecutions. Like I said, we've only answered the question if or whether that factor has an effect. And then increasing standards of data collection. I mentioned the data limitations before. If you want to know more about some of the data limitations of New Zealand police data in general, and what they do well, because there are certain parts of the data collection and data process that they do extremely well, and some where for research purposes, there are big holes. And that's in the data saga, the data stock taking gaps analysis report. So ngā mihi matakuikui kia koutou mō tō whakarongo me tō tautoko. No reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā rā tātou katoa.